Okay. Okay. Professor Adrian Rodgers, thank you that you're coming to our podcast. We have already our podcast. I think it's around 20 with a foreign guest, but we have already more than 100 for podcast with Indonesian nationality as a persons. Thank you for coming. And we will have some question, or maybe you can also explain about yourself,
Sure.
about the education, and about United States and Indonesia.
Okay.
Can you please tell to us about yourself, your education, and what is your relation with Indonesia?
Okay, so nama saya Adrian dari Universitas Negeri Ohio. So practice my bahasa Indonesia,
Yeah.
right? So, but I'll do this in English.
Okay. So people call you Adrian,
yes,
or Professor Rodgers?
No, Adrian. So nama Indonesia, Adrian, right?
Okay.
So we should use
Okay.
that name. Yeah. And I'm a faculty member at Ohio State University, which is a large university in the United States. And I should say, before we say anything else, that anything that I say today is my view and not necessarily the view of Ohio State University. So our university has had a big collaboration with Indonesia since 1962.
Yeah.
That was the time we took the first Fulbright student from Indonesia at Ohio State University. And since then, we have collaborated in many ways. So one way is to continue to take Fulbright students. And then for the past 20 years, we have had a memorandum of understanding between OSU, sometimes some other American universities, and many Indonesian universities. So we have now just entered our 4th MOU, and we have about 15 Indonesian university partners here. And what we focus on is 6 ways of collaborating. So 3 inbound and then 3 outbound.
Okay.
When we think about, as you know, right, when we think about international collaboration, we always think about in and out.
Okay.
And then who is doing what. So for Americans coming to Indonesia, we would be thinking about students, S1 or S2 or S3 students coming here to do whatever they do. We think about docent or faculty, thinking about what they're coming here to do. And then we might think about community members. So an example of a community member connected to a university might be an alumni who now works outside the university, but is interested to do something in Indonesia. And then likewise for Indonesians going to Ohio State University, we think about students, sometimes S1, sometimes S2 or S3. We think about a docent, right? A faculty member coming to Ohio State University, maybe for some kind of program or postdoctoral work or something like that, a conference, right? And then we think about community members. So a community member might be an alum of a partner university here who has graduated. Maybe now they're a docent, but at a non-partner Indonesian university, but they want to come for, SAME or, classroom sit-in or those kinds of things. So that demonstrates the bilateral relationship across 6 sectors of activity.
So I call you Adrian or Professor Rodgers?
Adrian.
Adrian. So I just want to make
sure.
Yes,
we're friends.
My name is Oni Bibin. So I know the culture, American culture, to call with the first name, but here sometimes people just call it also with Pak, which is meaning it's also Mr.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, Adrian. So how big is the Ohio State University? I know it's one of the biggest public university in US, right?
Right. So we measure, in different ways, by number of campuses, by enrollment, and then if it's by enrollment, is it the enrollment on one campus or many campuses? So we have 5 campuses. We have one very large one in Columbus, Ohio. It has 50,000 students. 40,000 students are S1, and then 10,000 students are graduate students, Pastor Sajana. So S2, S3, professional school like dentistry or MD. And then we have 4 other campuses. They are all S1 and more for local Ohio students.
So Adrian, you are a professor at the Department of Education.
Right. So we have, I think it's 14 facultas. And so one of facultas is Pendidikan, right? College of Education and Human Ecology. And in that college, we have 3 departments.
So College of Education and then 3 departments.
Yeah, so one department focused mostly on teaching and preparing teachers for schools. One department focused mostly on leadership, you know, the principalship, superintendency, educational policy, research. And then one department focused on movement, kinesiology, nutrition, and those kinds of things.
So, well, in my understanding, it's normally in Indonesia. What I understand is the education was divided into the class like K-12, as junior high or senior high, into these 3 departments in which they place.
All in one. So we do pre-service training, same as here, right? The teacher, a high school student in Indonesia who wants to be a school teacher will do their S1 in Pendidikan. But then they also get to decide their major, TK, SD, high school, maybe science education, Bahasa Indonesia, and the same over there. So they would do their studies in the Department of Teaching and Learning, and they are focused on, they will pick their teacher license. Do they want to teach younger kids, older kids? Do they want to teach science or reading and writing, like that?
So Ohio State University, it's public university, it's a normal university, but you have very big the educational college of education.
Yeah, so it's a public university, and then we have because we are very interested in Pendidikan and school education, we've worked very hard to create good programs, and our university, the College of Education, is ranked in the top 15 in the United States, and our university is ranked in the top 16 in worldwide.
Because, you know, in Indonesia, how we structure the university, the top 3 universities don't have the College of Education. The College of Education is normally, previously it's IKIP, that now become the normal university, the public university, but very strong ground in with the educational cohort or groups like NJ, UP, that's previously what we call it. You're familiar with
this? Yes, of course, So the 4 the 4 institutions in Indonesia that have a global recognition, are UI, the Agriculture Institution in Bogor, the Engineering Institution in Bandung, and the institution UGM, Universitas Gadjah Mada, in Jogja. And of course, none of them have an education program because of the IKIP tradition. So now other universities are emerging with famous national programs, like UBI, UNY, and then there are too many to name. So many good ones.
Because at the same time, since you also observer of educational curriculum or system, because I know the top university in US, they have College of Education as part of their program.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Harvard does. Yale and Princeton do not.
Stanford has.
Stanford has. Cornell does not.
So it's really depends.
It really depends on the history of the tradition at that university.
But we want to know how come that you become a professor? What is your previous background and your role?
How did this start? Okay, so my grandma was a teacher, my dad was a teacher, and 2 of my brothers were teachers. Do you see the trend?
So
I must be a school teacher. And then when I was a school teacher, I did a lot with drama with the school students. And I got interested in drama education. So I looked for a place to do Estiga in drama education, and I found the Ohio State University. They had a drama education program. So I went there as a student, and then after graduating, I had some other positions, and then ended up back at Ohio State University.
Interesting. So you interested because you are a drama teacher?
Yes.
Wow. Because you know, in United States, called sky is the limit. Normally, what we call sky is the limit is one is to become rich, one is to become famous because you have in Hollywood.
I do not want either. Well, I would take the money. If you want to give me, I will take. Okay. But no one goes into education to become rich.
Yeah.
And I am fine not being famous.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Because I know drama teachers, you want to become famous like the.
Yeah. So no, so sometimes
Okay.
drama education is about you know, helping the school age student maybe do modeling or be TV appearance or a movie. But most teachers who are doing drama education, they're more interested in exploring morals or dilemmas or problems that kids face or things like that. So the kinds of kids that often end up in trouble in drama education, you know, pimple, greasy hair, not model.
So since you've been here in Indonesia, I think several times, you observe what happened into our education system, the K-12, what do you think to Indonesian education? Because as far as I remember, I never took classes in drama during my elementary, junior, or senior high school.
Yeah, well, there are many questions in what you said there. So first of all, what an amazing accomplishment Indonesian education has made. I mean, if you think about the past 100 years, I've read a little bit about the history of Indonesia. And you had your first medical school in the 1920s. And in 100 years, you have a national system of education of schools, and then the diploma program, the S1 through S3, and also bachelor, master, and doctoral degree, S1, S2, S3. And you have accomplished all of this in just 4 generations. Only 3 generations since independence, right? So August 17th, 1945. So what, in 78 years, 3 generations, you've accomplished all of this across 15,000 students. What a stunning accomplishment that you have done. I think that's absolutely amazing. And then the second thing that I would say is, you know, when I first started collaborating with Indonesia, a challenge that came up was the issue of the major. So for example, if you start out with S1 in linguistics and you are seeking funding to do S2 or S3 in Pendidikan, must be linguistics, right? And the same for Pendidikan. And so now there's a little bit of flexibility there where, if the linguistics is related to second language learning, then yes, okay. But still, what I did, where I changed from S1 in Bahasa Inggris to S1 in Pendidikan, S2 in history, S2 in Pendidikan, and then S3 in Pendidikan, you still probably could not do that here, right? So I hope that that continues to open up and give students more flexibility, because as we take our path through life, right, our interests change, the opportunities that we have changed, the kinds of positions that we can have changed. So I hope to see more change there. Yeah,
I agree, because here what they call linear.
Right.
Linear. You need to have the same path if you do the education in S1, S2, S3, or the same.
And then on a very different level, you said, when I was in school, I did not do drama.
That's
right.
That's
so what I would say is, you know, to help get the amazing work done that you have done, it's the Ministry of Education that has a national system, right? So in the US, education is managed by the state, but in Indonesia, it's managed by 2 ministries, right? Ministry of Islamic Affairs and Ministry of Education. And, you know, that means they had a lot of ownership over the curriculum. And really only recently, because of COVID, we have the curriculum Merdeka, right? The freedom curriculum, where because of COVID.
And because of the Mas Menteri.
Because of
Mas Menteri is the minister.
Oh, right.
Pak Nadiem.
Right. So we had COVID demanding that teachers have more freedom to do their implementation, and we had at the same time a leader who was willing to give this freedom, right? And I think that's still evolving, because that's a very, very new curriculum, only 2-3 years old. You know, it's 3 years old, but the first year doesn't really count because it was COVID time still. So, you know, really only 2 years old. But with that freedom, I think will come more opportunity. And so if you want to be the drama student now, maybe there's a chance to do that where you couldn't before, right? Because you'll be an interested teacher. Now, what you do have in Indonesia, you have a lot of dance curriculum.
Dance
Right.
curriculum.
There's dance in the school, and then there is also dance by private teacher. And you also have music, a lot of music in the curriculum. So
they have for
both instrument, you have traditional instruments, and you have you know, some singing, and then also related to traditional is the singing that would go with wayang.
That's correct.
Right. So it's a rich tradition of arts.
Yeah, I also took that in during my school year. So the menari and also the music, but not the drama. Drama is always for extracurricular activities. And so if you compare with what happened in US and you observe, can you also compare on contrast what happened into Indonesia, pre-university education in what happened in the United States?
Yeah, so one of the things, when I bring SATU students here, I always tell them never compare the two countries. The students always want to say in America like this, or in Indonesia like this, but really it's a false comparison. Much better to say in Jakarta like this, in New York like this, or we might say, you know, in Banda Aceh like this, but in Anchorage, Alaska like that, right? Or in Honolulu, Hawaii like this, but in Gorontalo like that. Because, you know, the schooling in a big city might be different than in a college town, might be different in a very, very rural area. So that's one thing that I would think about, right? The other thing I think is, of course, in the urban area, there's always a lot of opportunities, right? Because there's a lot of resources. But I think with time, what we're seeing now is, you know, the 4G and 5G connection is expanding even into the rural areas. So what used to be a very isolated place before is not so much isolated anymore. Right. So when I first came 15 years ago, if I was in Kota Samarang, and I had you know, Telkomsel, my Telkomsel will not work over here with Indosat, right? But now 5G everywhere. Does not matter. Indosat, Telkomsel, doesn't matter, right? So even in the rural area, you know, we have maybe not 5G, but 4G.
Okay, since you mentioned about the technology development, so do you think the digital divide is still exists? It's going wider, or because of technology there, meaning I can study and also using the online program. I know there must be some program that I have, or do you think is actually closing the gap between? What do you comment?
So both. So the first thing I would say is, yes, we do have STIGA and educational technology all online. So, but to get back to your question, right? So every 15-year-old, every high school student in Indonesia, not in Indonesia, but in many places that I have been, they have Hopin. Right. So, and they can go many places that have free Wi-Fi. So yes, I mean, the digital divide is closing in that respect, right? But then recently I was in Purwokerto in Jawa Tengah, and the docent explained to me, you know, I would say, what if we make the assignment like this? And they go, no, we cannot make the assignment like that because the students will not work on a laptop. They only work on Hopin. So we must make an assignment that can work on Hopin, not on laptop, which means they're only using 2 fingers, not 10 fingers, right? So that means many short response instead of one long response. And sometimes many short response is good, but sometimes you do need one long response, right? So I think that the answer about digital divide is both, sometimes closing, but sometimes still big.
You know, the issue of literacy, since you also the expert on this, and I know in this country, I think it's happened also in the United States, we have compulsory studies for, I think, until 16 years. So 12 years, 12 years compulsory at the at school.
Yeah.
That's mandatory.
Right.
I know not in every country, but then at the same time, we say the progress is big when we introduce they call it SD Impress at the time, was I think 30, 40 years ago. And it became also source of inspiration for Esther Duflo. That's the name of the Nobel Prize winner in economics,
right,
from Harvard, that we see and her colleagues do what they call the random control trial. So he explained this using the econometric, and then what happened with the SD Impress, it's increased Indonesian education, but was 40 years ago. Today, it seems that according to Bappenas, the Ministry of Planning, so actually we need to do something because the country is not going more knowledgeable, and we need to do some drastic regulation or drastic change. And because of that, what do you think about this type of opinion?
I have a theory about this very thing.
Okay.
In fact, when I go to Aceh, I will present about this very topic. So this next week I got up on to Aceh
and what is
to give a speech on this very topic. So my theory is this: that the Ministry of Education, they own the curriculum, right? All of the teachers, they are civil servants, so they own the teacher, and therefore they own the problem. And the problem is on an international survey, the PISA study, right, that Indonesia is ranking near the bottom, and they're not competing with Singapore. And sometimes when we try to solve this problem, we look, who is the top? Singapore. Who is the top? Finland. And to me, this is a false comparison, right? Because you can drive across Singapore in 1 hour. You cannot drive across Indonesia in 1 hour, right? So you really want to compare yourself to other countries that are as big, that have many, many, many different languages, that have very rich, very poor, and a country that's, a much better point of comparison, right? So maybe like the United States or like Australia,
China,
because those countries are big.
That's right.
Especially in US, they have many languages spoken, right? Sometimes Chinese, sometimes Spanish. Some schools have, many languages spoken in the school. Same here. There are places in Indonesia you can go, and there's 3 or 4 languages spoken in the school, right? So, Bugis, Dayak, right, and Bahasa Indonesia, of course. So I think that would be helpful to think about different and none of those countries are ranked in the top 2 or top 3, but they are ranked in the top 15 or the top 20. And so you want to try and move your position from, number 50 up to number 20. I think that is a much better comparison, right? And my theory is that, I will go into a first grade classroom and I will watch the students do their writing. They write 1 word. The teacher asks them to write 1 word, they write 1 word. The teacher asks them to write 2 words, they write 2 words. So it's not the problem, it's not the kid, the problem is the teaching is too easy.
The teaching
is too easy. We have to make it harder. We can ask more from our students. We can get them to work harder. Not write 1 word, write 10. Not write 2 words, write 30. Right? Not read 1 paragraph, read 1 chapter. And we could get them to do much more. And if we did, and the direction to do that should come from the ministry with the curricular materials, with the lesson plan. I mean, the ministry provides the lesson plan. The teacher is only doing what they are told, right? I have been in many classrooms, and when I talk to the teacher, I say, show me the lesson plan. Always, every single time they can, in 10 seconds, split out, here, right here. So they're following the plan, right? But I think the curriculum could be much more challenging, and then you would get the results.
So, but by saying that the curriculum more challenging is also you bringing the issue on curriculum, meaning it's the responsibility of the government, which
Right.
is in that case, it's the central government.
Yes.
Because they are the one who devised the curriculum and decided to the whole nation adopting this, even though the Mas Menteri says it's become curriculum merdeka.
Right.
But at the same time, the curriculum is important.
Right.
And then you can, because of that curriculum, you can make comparison.
Yes.
But again, on the other side, you mentioned that the country is too big.
Not too big. I never said too big. I said the country
is big. Yeah. Because the PISA score for Jakarta students probably different than the Aceh or places which is outside far because of less hour, less you mentioned rigorous educator doing the curriculum, because I know in Jakarta mostly that the quality of education is good enough.
Okay.
But I do not know how the PISA score, do they make a comparison between people in Shanghai, into Singapore or Jakarta or to other city? Because it will be a different case.
Okay.
Because it's different in what in Jakarta probably different than what happened in other city.
Yeah. So first to think about national comparison.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm not an expert on PISA score. It's been a while since I looked. But when you look at China, the score, it says China. But then you look at the star and it says results for China are from Shanghai.
Shanghai and Hong Kong.
So it's not China.
That's right.
It's Shanghai.
That's correct.
And then there's Hong Kong, usually separate lines.
Yes, that's correct.
And then then for Indonesia, they are not breaking out Jakarta separately, although I'm sure you could probably get that data. Right. Yeah. But results for Indonesia are not complete. Yeah. Because the sampling is not complete and not all of the assessments have been run. So, I think a couple of times ago, it was more complete. The most recent time, less complete. The important thing is not the magic number. The important thing is what's going on in the classroom.
Yes,
and of course, that should be reflected in the number. And we already know, I mean, the ministry says we have a vision and we're not there yet, right? So we're working on it, which is good. That's good. That raises the question, how is it that we work on it? They're doing many things. They have 5th-year induction program now, so you finish 4 years as SATU and then must do 1-year bridging program before you can be a teacher. Also, for the teachers who are already licensed, they must do this program, so they have 1 year removed from the classroom and they spend 1 year, maybe a little less, but in this program. I know because my STIGA students are studying it, right, looking at this curriculum. But to go back to the idea that maybe the curriculum is behind the student and we can have a more ambitious curriculum. As part of Merdeka curriculum, the idea was to have sustained silent reading time. So every week, there must be so many minutes, I think 20 minutes, set aside for sustained silent reading. I went into one school in Makassar, called Makassar. It's a public school. They literally have books hanging from the tree. So they order the books, they're out in the park between each classroom. The teachers have taken books and clamped them on the tree like leaves. And the kid can come along and go, I will read. But I've been to another school in a more rural area, and the children have no books. There are no books. Where are the books? Oh, we don't have any books. And so the teacher will take a worksheet and copy the worksheet. And so the students have to read a worksheet. Would you want to read a worksheet? I would not want to. So of course they don't really read, they just sit quietly for 20 minutes, right? But that's a good example of how the curriculum is behind the student, right? These kids want to read, they sit there, nothing to read.
Okay, so other than one of the issues is curriculum. Another issue is about the teacher, not the teacher education, but the teacher itself. A couple of days ago is Hari Guru Nasional. So all the guru in Indonesia have celebrated.
Yeah, Friday, teacher day, that's right.
And it's also important because at the same time, the guru here, I think the civil servant, the majority civil servant is actually guru.
Right.
But even in the guru, they have also the honor guru and the civil servants guru.
Yes.
But according to the new law, the honor guru is also become a civil servant with part-time duty.
Yes.
Was a month ago.
Yes.
That will be lasted until the end of next year.
Yeah, contract.
Yeah, it's a good contract.
Yeah.
That's another issue. But
it's a funding issue.
Yeah, the
right?
funding issue. Because at the same time, the funding issue is not enough.
Yeah.
But the number of guru is small.
Yeah.
Then we need to have. But then the quality guru become less controllable because if you have good enough funding, then you have a good quality of lecturer or teacher.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. So I remember if you pay low, then you will get not good enough, something like that. It's not.
Of course, if you pay low, you will have a smaller pool.
Yeah.
And therefore, we need to pay teachers a living wage, right? But if we pay them double or triple, do you think the quality will go up double or triple?
That's why
I don't know.
You know, in Jakarta, salary guru, I think it's better than other cities.
I'm not sure.
Simply because in Jakarta, they have, the salary system is different.
Right.
Because of the regulation has to link with the PAD, pendapatan asli daerah. It's the state income.
Right.
Because they have income from the tax. That's why it will contribute to the pay of the teacher in Jakarta.
Right.
So the pay of teacher in Jakarta, it's better than pay teacher in other state, in other province.
Yeah, but it costs more to live here.
The life,
So maybe the pay is more.
No, I mean, if you compare with the civil servant, civil servant of central government.
Right.
So in Jakarta, you have civil servant central government, civil servant for Jakarta state.
Right.
But the salary of people in civil servant Jakarta state is much higher.
Okay.
I say much higher.
Right.
Because here the pool is different.
Yeah.
And the local teacher in Jakarta is actually paid, they have better salary than the central government.
Yeah, so they will try to migrate to the other system, the one that pays more, right?
Yeah. But here the majority of civil servant central government is in Jakarta.
Right.
But it's only, I think it's 800,000 civil servant for central government.
Right.
Only 80,000 for local government.
Right.
I think it's around 40%. 40% probably. 40,000 and in terms of this, they have a better salary.
Right.
And in my opinion, because of that, it contributes that in Jakarta, the student will have a better performance in their education system.
I think you're going to have a better pool, a better pool of people attracted to the profession. But let me give you this example. So I was in a school and I sat in the classrooms of different teachers. And I visited many schools in the past 15 years across Indonesia. I've sat in many classrooms just watching. And I would say that if I had to rate the teachers, the very best teacher that I saw is in one school in Jawa Tengah. And the very worst teacher that I saw is in the same school in Jawa Tengah. And I watched these two lessons that are taking place 30 meters apart on the same day at the same time by teachers who are paid the same. So I will describe the lesson for you, right? So the best lesson, the teacher wants to teach about reading. And so she has divided her students into groups. They start with an introduction. So she created a book. And we say in Bahasa Inggris, a big book, which means it's an oversized book. So all of the students can see the one big book. And as the whole class, they read the book together. She made this book herself. Then she asked them questions about the book. And so she sent them into different groups to work on different questions. And each group has a different job. Some have to read other books. Some have to create something. Some have to write something. And then at the end of the lesson, they come back and they share their work. So I thought a very, very creative lesson. Well done. Interesting things for the students to do. A lot of ways they are using their reading, their writing, should be doing. teacher. She is a good teacher. So she tells the students what to do. They go and sit and do it. There is one special needs student. He has a severe special need. So he gets up and starts to run around the classroom, running. 5 minutes, running. 10 minutes, running. Yeah, the students are finished their job. They're supposed to have the teacher check it. So they get up and they go and they make a cue, right? A line next to the teacher. And she checks, and she reads, and then she makes a suggestion, and the student goes sit down. And after a few minutes, there was a long line, 20 students long. And she is giving 30 seconds around the room. At one point, the kid running around the room decided to make a break for it. And he started to go for the open window and climb out. And only then did he get her attention. She went over and gently guided him back to his seat. She went back to work on the line. And then the kid who was running, he got up and started running around the room again. So in 45 minutes, I got up, I just kind of looked to see what the students have written. They have written 3 or 4 words in 45 minutes, spent most of their time waiting in line. Okay. And we have a severely special needs student spend most of his time doing aerobic. So sad, right? Lots of opportunities for advancement, right? We could make this so much better.
Yeah, I know. There must be some improvement need to bring.
Yeah, but I'm sure the teacher was following most of the lesson plan. I'm sure she was more or less doing what she was told. And, I think that that's part of the goal of this, bridging program, this 1 year of program where they are doing retraining with some of the already qualified teachers, that they're trying to, they adopt a problem-based learning approach. So the teacher, so the teacher must identify a problem in their classroom they want to address. So if it was this teacher, who has the long line, her problem might be, how can I reach more students without them spending so much time waiting in the line? And of course, the other teacher had already done it. They're in groups, she's going around checking, right? They are not waiting on her. She is working on getting around to each of them. Okay, so she just changed it using the group strategy instead of whole class strategy. So it's not impossible to change, but it was a good example of how the teaching in one classroom is behind the student. And then the teaching in the other classroom is ahead of, like on the edge of their learning, getting them to do new things. And so that I think is the challenge in Indonesian teacher education.
Thank you. Because since you mentioned these two comparisons, at the same time, there is a support system, right? In US and also here. And Mas Menteri already uploaded, made some application that people, the teacher can interact, that they can share their knowledge. So these two issues on waiting on queue and this special need student, I think it's also common issue that every teacher will face in their daily life. So they can share and probably they will have it will take time as long as there is some support group and mechanism to ask or help. And as I understand, they get an application for this. And I hope it will improve. But I want to more digging on the special needs student. Because I know that there is a regulation or permit that basically in some school there is you have to allocate it some percentage. I do not know, 10%, 20% of the class for special need assistant. I do not know it's happening in US or they need to go to the special class or to go more in the normal class, because here in Indonesia they go for the normal class.
So let's see. I think the topic of special education is very difficult to discuss because there are many different cases. Right? And, what is the special need? Are they behind in their reading? Do they have, blindness? Do they have deafness? And so it's very about the case, right? About this case, and then what are the resources at school? So it's just a really challenging to think about. you mentioned about separate class versus what, are they in the class? And so that's another thing, right? So do they receive additional services in the regular classroom? In America, we call that mainstreaming. Do they receive additional, they are functioning with the other students on many things, but not some. So we pull them out for help on that one thing, right? So that's a pull-out model, right? So a resource room, right? An extra teacher in an extra space where they can go and get extra help. Or do we have some students who have needs that are best dealt with in small groups with one teacher? So what we might typically call special education, they're not interacting with all the students, they're just interacting with a small number of students. So, I mean, those are three different models. There are more, but those are three. And I think that that's something that, you're starting to think about here. And a lot of times it depends on the resources of the school. So, and also the parent, I think different, what we see as a teacher is a clear need. The parent sometimes thinks, no, there's no special need with my child. So, there's a lot of opportunities to think about how we can support, how we can best support students and their parents. But it's a challenging conversation because all of the needs are very different.
Other than that, the Mas Menteri also introduced the liberal art style of teaching or education. In Indonesia is you don't have to be linear to continue, but you need to have a more broader education for people, things that the student like to aspire later in their life, in the senior high school or in the university life. That's what the curriculum Merdeka. But then he also introduced what the standardized test. So the national exam entrance examination, for a long period of time, people doing an expertise or digging into, let's say, math, physics, chemistry, they still do this, but at the same time now introduce more on the standardized test, what they call the aptitude test. And I think for around 50% of the school SMPT, sekolah standar masuk seleksi masuk perguruan tinggi, di around 50% to top uni or to national university, they have to go through the standardized test, Indonesian standardized test, which I think it's also mimicking what happened with the SET or ACT, Scholastic Aptitude Test. That's bringing more on general knowledge, not onto the spatial knowledge of the subject. Right. They have the spatial subject, but it will be different. But 50% places at the university in Indonesia will be selected based on the student performance on the standardized test, right? The SET-like test, right? Which is, I think, is also mirrored with the PISA test, right? And there is some pro and con, but it was, I think, it's the second year this year, but it will have impact probably into next generation because. And I think it's happened also in US. There will be pro and con. Some people agree. So, what is your comment on this thing?
In America, we have a big testing industry, right? Somebody makes a lot of money, not me. So, and it sounds like there's an interest in developing more testing here. So, of course, testing can be helpful if it helps inform your decision-making process. But sometimes I see testing that does not inform the decision-making process. So a test that every parent will know if they have a child attending school is the literacy test that is done at the beginning of first grade to see if you can read. Because when you talk to Indonesian parents or teachers and you say, at what age do children learn to read? They always say first grade, right? So why is it that we do a literacy assessment to get into first grade? It just makes no sense. And then for the kindergarten teacher for TikTok, they are not allowed to teach about the literacy task. They can if they are private pay, but it is not in the TECOC curriculum. So this is, to me, is a good example of how the thinking about literacy between TECOC and Kelas 1 and the assessment, it's not aligned, right? That we could rethink that so it would make much more sense. That we could do some literacy activities at TECOC, we would assess them with an assessment, and that would help inform our decision about where the students will go in first grade and what kinds of instruction they can receive and what they need to learn and things like that. And so when you get to this example about college placement, I mean, the reason to have such an assessment is we have too many students and not enough spots. But I think this requirement is probably only for Universitas Negeri, right? It does not apply to private. So what this will do is it will limit spots at the state university, and it will create business for private university who will take the students who could not get into Negeri, right? Well, okay, as long as we know that that's what's happening. And, you know, if the Universitas Negeri can use these results to help inform what they can be teaching, especially in the first year, where the students are already strong, where the students can use improvement, then it has a purpose. If there are not enough spots in the university, then it has a purpose, right? You know, I think these would be the things that we would need to think about, and I will hope that somebody's thinking about it.
Because I remember in US, people, when they took a preparatory scale for standardized tests, what you mentioned, the private company who make a business on this, they said, this test is not measurement of your IQ, it's not measurement of your intellectual, it's measurement of how good you are in taking the test.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's what in the US. But here is the belief, if you are good in the standardized test, basically the chance that you can success at the university is higher, and the chance to be a successful person is also much higher.
Yeah, so I think to me, it's much more about, like you said, the pool of knowledge and the pool of people. So, you know, at my university, we have 5 campuses. So at one campus, it is limited to students who get a certain score on the SAT. But the other 4 campuses, not limited to that. As if you graduate high school, you can come to the campus. So that would be another thing to think about. You know, if you have a big state university that has too many students, maybe they could use this to limit the pool. Whereas other state universities does not have too many students, they could have an open admission. But what I heard you say is the rule is all university everywhere, and it's half, right? Half the seats.
Half of the seats.
So then the others, all the remaining pool will compete for the other half, which of course raises the question: well, what will be the criteria for the other half, right?
It can be anything.
Yeah,
this course can be combination with the.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it could be a particular talent. You know, somebody's going to study music and their piano is really good, but they did badly in the test. It's still okay, right? I mean, they're studying piano, so it could be that, right? Oh, it could be diversity or affirmation.
Affirmation,
right?
That's correct.
Yep.
Because you know, since you mentioned about the Fulbright in 1962, starting with Ohio State University.
Yeah.
And
that's when we had our first Fulbright. Yeah.
And I know there are a lot of Fulbrighters.
Yes.
Was well known from the Ohio State University.
Yeah.
Especially for presidential elections.
Yes.
Because at the time, the Fulbrighters, also Indonesian government, sent to Ohio State University under the Professor Bill Little.
Yes, and my colleague.
Called Little Boys.
Yeah.
And now they have become a pollster.
That's right.
Which is important for topic.
Yes.
The presidential election today.
Yeah.
Even though probably it's different because pollsters probably 10, 20 years ago, it's important, but today it's less and less because pollster is like sampling, right?
Yes.
So this one is probably another issue. How you call digital hoax,
right?
And I don't know, a lot of this type of thing.
Right.
But the interesting is Ohio State University plays important because a lot of full Indonesian bride sent to Ohio State, learning there and came back to here.
Yeah.
And now, what I understand, a lot of Indonesian educators went to your university, Ohio State University, under Pak Adrian.
Oh, well, okay.
They will come back.
I didn't think you were going to say that.
As it will come back, it will, you know, will enrich Indonesian education system.
Yeah.
Because, you know, your university has an influence on what happened in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Because there will be a new wave, and that new wave will be under Pak Adrian.
Well,
so, what is your intakes on the students or the postgrad that will go to your place? I understand there will be Fulbright and LPDP.
Okay.
And USAID.
Yeah. So I have my colleague is Bill Little. And I don't see a lot of him because I'm in Facultas Pendidikan. He's in the political science department. I think the last time I saw him was pre-COVID, so 2018. But he and I attended a meeting about our engagement with Indonesia.
He's already retired.
He has retired now, but also still active doing Indonesian things. And sometimes I email him if I get something that I think he will be interested in. So he still goes to the office. He still goes, yes.
Oh, yeah?
Yes. And when I talked to him about a year and a half ago, he goes, oh, I'll look at it when I go to the office next week. So he still goes to the office. He still travels.
Is it okay that in Ohio?
Yes, we can.
Already retired?
Yes, already retired.
But still get the office.
Emeritus. Yeah. So they must stay away for 2 months. And then after that, they can come back. They can get office space. And then if they're still working on projects that is aligned with our mission, then they're allowed to use the office space. And we have a title. We have a Professor Emeritus, retired, but still doing things. And my colleague Bill, I don't know him well, but he was still doing things here, still consulting and conferring. He helped me actually because we had a Pendidikan student who had an LOA to come to OSU. And they did not get an LPDP scholarship. And so we asked about that because there is a provision in the LPDP that you can write. If you have an LOA, you can say, look, I have an LOA, I request funding. And so he was helping, he gave me some guidance on that. So Bill has always been a great friend to Indonesia. I think he's a Yale graduate. We mentioned Yale University earlier, and they have a cultural studies center there, right? So I think that's how he came to do his first work here. And like you said, he's a good example of a faculty member who had a big influence and impact on Indonesia. And then when you mentioned now, you were so kind as to talk about the Indonesians coming to America generally, and in our case, Ohio State University. And one of the things I always notice with them is that as soon as they come back, they have a big impact. So one thing is they often are promoted. I just had one of my advisees who is from Sumatra. He interviewed for a promotion before he graduated with STIGA. He had to fly back to do the interview because it's 2 or 3 day process, and then fly back to America and got the promotion, even though he is not finished, right? And then other STIGA graduates, they come back and very soon they are promoted. And I have now another advisee now, I'm working with her. And I remember before she applied, I was here in Jakarta and she happened to be in Jakarta. And I said, oh, let's meet for coffee. And we met and I said, why do you want to do STIGA? And she said, because I want to work for dictate and influence policy. What a vision. What a vision. Of course, we don't know, right, what will happen after she graduates, but she has the vision. And I was very impressed by that. And then she said, can you write me a reference letter? Because I had worked with her in Estua. And I said, oh, yeah. And you just give me a sentence I will use in my reference letter for you. And after she graduates, I will put this in a reference letter. So, but that kind of, I also have another advisee just finished, and he's also made like a national consulting group of Indonesian teacher educators trying to influence and have input on policy. So this is a really good example of how when Indonesians travel to these programs, wherever they may be, in the US, UK, Australia, in Netherlands, in Japan, they always do what I can't say always, but, the ones I know of have done really well and have come back and served their country well by performing well, thinking deeply, and then trying to influence policy at scale, because the scale in Indonesia is enormous, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so I was impressed with their work.
So actually, I've been in Professor Bill Little house.
Okay.
Long time ago. That
All
was
right.
in 1994.
Okay. Yeah.
With all the big names that he become his legacy, the
Okay.
students that graduate from Bill Little.
Okay.
But I'm not working as a political scientist.
So in 1994, that's an interesting date.
Yeah,
that was the year that I started STIGA study at OSU. So we were on campus at the same time.
So 1994.
Yeah.
Are you attending the?
Yeah, I attended
this conference.
STIGA student, but remember, I'm pendidikan,
so
I would not have been.
Okay, because in 1994, Professor Bill Little with the consortium MUCIA,
right,
Middle West University Collaboration Indonesian America.
Yeah.
So they organized big conference on post-Suharto Indonesian politics, post-Suharto in 1997. Yeah. So what they're talking about 1994, what happened in 97, because it predicts at the time that President Suharto will step up. Right. But what happened is actually President Suharto continued in 1998 until he step aside and was removed. So that's my story. Yeah. When I've been in Old Columbus at the time. Yeah, long time ago.
So we have other faculty who do work here in Indonesia. So although Bill has retired, he's still active. He has a colleague, Jan Perskala. Jan Perskala does work with the World Bank here in Jakarta. So he's sometimes in Jakarta. I have a colleague, Sharon Clark. So her parents are Indonesian. She's an Indonesian speaker. She is a physician, medical doctor, and she does a lot with medical training. So she is just working now on having some of the OSU doctors do an observation in Bali with some physicians there for a month early next year. And then I have other colleagues. Jackie Goodway has done a lot of work here in Indonesia in terms of physical education and movement. So yeah, we have a lot of faculty who enjoy our work here. And now I have new colleagues. So Teddy Chow in mathematics education. He's just finished a Fulbright at UPI in Bandung and goes back, talks a lot about his interesting work there. And I think, the power of Zoom helps engage by distance, right? So we don't always have to be, spending 2 days on a plane when we can just spend 2 hours doing the class, right? Rather than, less time on the plane, more time in the class is good.
Okay, so I continue my experience with some of the graduate was I think it's Denny J. Ali, Rizal Malang. That's big name SMRC. I forgot the name, but a lot of people who graduate there, I said, become apostles. So I predict, because also have a good quality, and now there are a lot of top educator mind from Indonesia going to your place, since you are head of direction of Indonesian American education collaboration. Yep. So it will also impact into Indonesian education system. That's simply my observation. But at the same time, do you have some advice to people, the young people who want to get the S2 or S3 with Fulbright, LPDP, and want to go to study at Ohio State University? What do they have to prepare, and how they can get all the information or good communication?
Yeah, okay, so there was a time when I was doing a lot of support for inbound students at Pascar Sanjana as to STIGA. And the advice that we would probably give a graduate student is different than the advice that we would give an undergraduate student. also the pool of students can be a little bit different, right? So in Pascar Sanjana, if you are an engineering or a business student, maybe your business is paying, or if it is a family business, maybe your family business is paying, and so you can be self-pay. On the other hand, especially in the helping professions like nursing or social work or education, right? You can never make enough money to be able to afford to go. So in those cases, those students usually are almost always on scholarship. So that's one thing to think about, the demographic of the people who are applying. So I created a blog. And when we are finished the recording, I will give you the web link for the blog. And then if you want to put it in the video, YouTube, you can, or you can put it in the comments on the YouTube, and then people can click on that. The advice is for students to come to my university in Pendidikan. But really, this is advice that will work for any graduate student at any graduate, institution. So I think the first challenge is thinking about the funding and the LOA. So, sometimes if you talk to some financial sponsor like LPDP, they might say, oh, you have to get the LOA first. And then other sponsors, oh, you have to get the funding first. Like Fulbright, you get the funding first, and then you do the applying. So understanding what is the procedure there would be important. Our advice is usually begin both at the same time. Because, it's not like you push a button and you have LOA. But getting the LOA is a year-long process, right? So begin both at the same time. And then as you proceed through, if Fulbright says apply after you get the funding, you just delay. If LPDP says apply now, funding will follow, then you speed up. So understanding that timeline, but getting both going at the same time, I think that's one good thing to do. The second thing to think about is the application package, right? So we know that a typical application package is going to have CV, it's going to have transcript, it's going to have reference letters, it will probably have some kind of sample, like maybe writing sample. If you were applying for engineering, maybe project sample or something like that. It might also include some test score, GRE, LSAT, something like that, TOEFL score or IBT score.
What is the standardized test average and TOEFL?
Yeah, so knowing what are the tests, right? So that's what the package will be. So one of the things that I would say about that is when you're writing the reference, when you're contacting your references, I have been on a panel of faculty making decisions about who we will take and who we will not take. And I have noticed there is a pattern that the Indonesian docent will write that is just not what we would have expected. And so sometimes for the Indonesian applicant, they are not impressing us. They're doing what they think they need to do, but they're not meeting what we expect. So, and I write about that on my blog, but one of the things that we would look for is a letter that is probably at least 1 page, if not 2 pages long. It must be on letterhead and signed. And it should specifically talk about what did this student do in the class? How did they contribute to the class? What is the evidence that this student is one of the top 10% or top 15% in the class? How did the student help other students? What is the student contributing to the field? How likely will the student do in a graduate program? All of these kinds of things, and very, very specific, like with an example. And so what we sometimes see from an Indonesian docent is checklist, check, 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 check. And that may meet the requirement for Indonesia, Pascar Sanjana, but not for us. It didn't tell us anything. So getting the reference to getting the student to impress on the reference, the need for this detailed description is really important. And then the other thing we sometimes see in Indonesian reference letter is this student has a good character, has good morals, they're a religious person, and so on. Again, for an Indonesian Pascar Sanjana, maybe this is a needed part. Yes. But for us, it is not against you, but we just ignore it because it's not relevant to our team. Yeah. So the last thing I would say, be sure to have on the letterhead. because there was a staff member who checked the letters, and if they see it's not on letterhead, reject it. And we did not write you, oh, Davey, you did not put on the letterhead. No, the guideline says letterhead. If you don't do it, it's rejected, right? So you just wasted all your time and effort because of no letterhead. So we had one time a student who had a docent write a letter of reference, but the docent is retired. So they cannot put on official letterhead. So I just said, have the docent go into Word document, and put the name of the university there. So they make a letter and then put in the explanation, I am emeritus and I'm writing from this, and you can verify and like that. And that's just because there was a staff who just quickly check for the reference, right? So that's one thing, I think, with the reference letters, to be really, really careful with them. Another thing that I would say is the statement of study. Thinking about what is the program that I want to apply to, and then trying to tailor your statement of study to that program can be very important. So, for example, if you are applying to literacy S3 studies in Indonesia, maybe they have one literacy program. At OSU, in our Fakultas Pendidikan, in our Department of Teaching and Learning, we have so many literacy programs. We have 5. 5 programs. So that means, we don't know which one of the 5 you want to apply to. So sometimes the Indonesian student will write a more general reference. Try to hit everyone. No, cannot. So you need to be very specific. Yeah. And name the faculty members you would like to study with. So it's a lot of research, right? Like if you are interested to come to OSU as an STIGA student, you should Google. You should see who is in what program. Because I am only in one program, not the other 4. If you want to study with me, you should read what I wrote. Is this somebody you want to study? Maybe you don't want to study with me. Maybe you want to study with this one. Because it has happened that, the applications come to us, the staff person checked for the letterhead, so it moves to us. We read the application, we all agree, yes, this one, we will accept this one. And then our next question is, who will be the advisor? And we might go, will you? No, because they're not interested in what I'm doing. Will you? No, because they're not interested. And we have had students we would want to accept, but we cannot identify the advisor. So, and then we reject. So such a shame, right? Such a shame. So what I would say is, you're not trying to impress the docent. Like, I love Adrian's work so much, I must study with him. Because then we see that as just trying to, not really being honest, right? But what you're trying to do is help us identify 1 or 2 people who you think would be a good advisor for you, so that we can match them to you. Now, it's not always possible. Sometimes, you apply, that person retired, or that person takes a year's leave and goes away, so we have to find another one. But, that will help us. And that means when you apply to many different universities, each letter of request is different. Right? Because you are targeting to that university, and not only that university, but that program. So the last thing that I would say is sometimes we at different, American universities, we do things that does not make a lot of sense, right? So if you look at like IBT and IELTS, if you Google concordance IBT IELTS, I think, if I got this right, the 79 on the IBT will be a 6.5 on the IELTS, right? So you would think that at, say, George Washington University, last time I looked, maybe it's changed now, but a few years ago when I looked, they said, we will accept student with IELTS 6.5 or IBT 100. Well, it's much harder. Much harder. Yeah, so in other words, if you are trying to get into that program at George Washington, take the IELTS. Because it's easier, right? On the other hand, if the score is the same, if the requirement is the same, our advice is always take the IBT, internet-based TOEFL. And the reason for that is we have noticed the students do better on the IBT than on the IELTS because there is no listening component. So the one last trick, all these tricks are on that blog,
okay.
right? But one last trick to think about would be these tests are expensive, right? They're 1.5 million.
Yeah.
If you live in the rural area, maybe you have to fly to the town and get a hotel to take the test and then take the test and fly back. So, you know, and you're not making a lot of money and maybe still waiting on funding.
Today it's already digital.
Yeah, okay.
Online.
Yeah, of course. It's digital, but you still must go to the testing center because they have to verify identity, right? So that's what I'm thinking about. Yeah, that you have to have your identity verified, unless that is entirely digital. But we do at OSU, never from Indonesia, but we have gotten fakes. We get imposters on a regular basis, and we work very hard to make sure the integrity in the system. So what I would say is, a little cheat that you can do here, the paper-based TOEFL is retired, but you can take the paper-based TOEFL for a small fee, maybe 200,000, 300,000, right? So if you are thinking about applying, why not take the paper-based TOEFL, 300,000, and then if your IBTs, you know, if you get 700 on the paper-based TOEFL. No, that's you can Google, right? The concordance, PBT, paper-based TOEFL, IBT, and you'll say, 700, 800. That means I will probably have an IBT score of very high.
They have.
Then spend the money on the IBT, right? But if your score works out to say a 70 IBT, maybe it is 500 paper-based TOEFL, 70 PBT. That does not meet the requirement for most US universities. So then you have two choices, right? Go take English class, or it would meet the requirement for Japanese university or for Dutch university. So you change goal. Okay, right, that would be another option. And you can make all of those decisions for 300,000 again. That's going to go.
And now today they have also Duolingo.
Even
it's
yeah,
free.
Yeah. So if you can Google, so long as there is a Google concordance and you can compare your score with what they think IBT or IELTS will be, that will save you money.
Yeah, but for Indonesian paper-based, even though it's already retired, it's still used for national university.
It's just, you know, I learned this because we had an applicant one time and she applies IBT 78. The requirement is 79. I met her here. Her rector said amazing things about her. We cannot accept. We cannot change the rule even by one thing. She takes again 77. She takes a third time, finally 80. but
you mentioned about
she spent all that money.
6.5.
Yeah, so she took IBT instead of IELTS, but she spent all that money. I was worried about the money that she's spending. So that's when I learned this kind of cheat, that if you take a much cheaper test, it will help predict your success before you spend a lot of money.
Adrian, this last question. Okay. What are you going to do after this in the next couple of weeks?
Oh, a couple of weeks.
And couple years, which related to Indonesia.
All right. So tomorrow I fly to Singapore for a conference there. I will be presenting the work of my STIGA student from Aceh. And he was doing pedagogy for TK training for S1 in TK. He was doing it right before COVID. His plan was to fly from America back to his university in Aceh province and COVID. He cannot go. So he decided he would do the training by Zoom. And then there was a case of COVID at the university, and the students must leave the university and go to their village. So they are in very, very rural Aceh, and there is no Zoom because this connection is too slow. So then he has to work out, how do I do the training using voice file and pictures that can be transmitted by 2G or 3G, which they can get in the village, right, on a good day. So that's when he did that and completed his dissertation, and that's what we'll be presenting at e-learning forum in electronic learning forum in Singapore. And then after that, I'll go to Aceh. I've been invited to be a presenter at a literacy conference there. So that's the next 2 weeks. And then in the next 2 years, we have a lot of Indonesian students in USA studying about Indonesia, and we're trying to get their work into publications. So that's our goal for the next 2 years, so that more people can learn about it.
So what kind of publication?
Right. So for Indonesia, they have placed a lot of recognition on Scopus Index journals, preferably top tier. And so that's where we're trying to get this really innovative work published.
Okay. Adrian, thank you very much for your time.
Hey.
I know we will meet again in the next, in the future.
Right.
And thank you very much for giving some enlightenment for me and also for the audience. And I will give your blog line to this. And thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for inviting me.
And see you later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.